When you hear the name J.P. Morgan, you think of power, of wealth, and of a financial empire that shaped America. But what if I told you the House of Morgan was built on the foundations of another man's empire? A man whose own name was overshadowed by the very dynasty he helped create. That man was George Peabody, the mentor and business partner who eventually brought Junius Spencer Morgan into his London firm. This is the untold origin story of American finance, the story of the man who chose philanthropy over dynasty, and in doing so, allowed another name, not his own, to become immortal. It is the dawn of the American experiment in 1795. George Washington is serving his second term as president. The United States is a young, fragile nation, a patchwork of 13 former colonies, still searching for its identity, clinging to the edge of a vast, wild continent. The air is thick with the promise of freedom, but also with the harsh realities of survival. In the small, unassuming town of South Danvers, Massachusetts, a place that would one day rename itself in his honor, George Peabody was born into a world devoid of privilege. His parents, Thomas and Judith Peabody, were hardworking but impoverished. Their lineage could be traced back to the early Puritan settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a heritage that instilled a powerful, almost severe sense of duty, frugality, and relentless toil. But ancestry couldn't put food on the table. The Peabody home was a bustling, chaotic place, filled with the noise and needs of 8 children. George was one of them, a single voice in a chorus of struggle. Life was a constant, grinding effort against scarcity. Every log for the fire, every potato from the garden, every patched piece of clothing was a small victory against the encroaching cold and hunger of a New England winter. In this era, childhood was a luxury few could afford. For the working poor, it was a brief, fleeting interlude before the crushing weight of responsibility descended. Education was a privilege, not a right. George attended the local district school, learning the rudimentary basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. But his time in the classroom was brutally short. His family's need was too great, the specter of poverty too immediate. After just 4 years of schooling, his formal education came to an abrupt end. He was 11 years old. Imagine that for a moment. At an age when most children today are just beginning to navigate the complexities of long division and social studies, George Peabody's childhood was over. He was thrust into the world of work not to earn pocket money for sweets, but to contribute to the fundamental survival of his family. This wasn't a choice. It was a decree handed down by circumstance. This early, abrupt departure from the world of learning would leave an indelible mark on him. It instilled in him a lifelong, almost reverential respect for the education he was denied, a passion that would later blossom into one of the most significant philanthropic endeavors in American history. But first, he had to learn the lessons of the world, and his classroom would be the unforgiving floor of a retail shop. His first job was as an apprentice in the dry goods store of a man named Captain Sylvester Proctor. It was here, amidst the scent of raw textiles, spices, and cured leather, that the foundations of his financial genius were laid. The work was grueling, the hours long, stretching from dawn until well after dusk. He was a shop boy, a dog's body, performing the most menial of tasks. But George was no ordinary apprentice. He was a sponge absorbing everything. He learned the intricate dance of commerce. He watched how goods were procured, how prices were set, how credit was extended, and crucially, how it was collected. He learned the art of negotiation not from a textbook, but by observing the shrewd haggling between farmers and merchants. He learned the importance of reputation, seeing how a man's word was his bond, and how a sullied name could mean financial ruin. He committed to memory the quality of different fabrics, the origins of various goods, the fluctuating costs of commodities. Every transaction, every conversation, every ledger entry was a lesson. While other boys were learning Latin, George Peabody was mastering the universal language of money. This period also forged his legendary frugality. He saw firsthand how precarious life was, how a single bad harvest or a delayed shipment could push a family over the edge. He learned to save every penny, to live simply, to view extravagance not just as a sin, but as a foolish risk. This was a habit that would stay with him for the rest of his life, a curious contradiction in a man who would one day handle millions. Even at the height of his wealth, he was known to travel in second-class carriages and mend his own clothes, a billionaire who never forgot the sting of the poverty he'd escaped. Opportunity in Danvers was limited. At the age of 16, driven by an ambition that was already burning fiercely within him, he left his hometown. He journeyed north to Thetford, Vermont, to live with his maternal grandfather, a brief and reportedly difficult stay. The real move came shortly after when he joined his elder brother David, who had opened his own dry goods store in Newburyport, Massachusetts. For a moment, it seemed like a path was set. He was working with family, applying the skills he had so diligently learned. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. In 1811, a catastrophic fire swept through Newburyport, reducing the heart of the town, including his brother's store, to ashes. Once again, George Peabody was cast adrift, his prospects seemingly incinerated along with the merchandise. This personal disaster coincided with a national one. Tensions between the young United States and the formidable British Empire had reached a breaking point. In 1812, war was declared. It was a conflict that would test the very soul of the new nation, a second war of independence. For George Peabody, it was a call to duty. He volunteered, serving in a company of artillery at Fort Warburton, a fortification on the Potomac River tasked with defending the nation's new capital, Washington, D.C. This experience, though brief, was profoundly shaping. It exposed him to a world beyond the confines of a small-town shop. He was part of a great national struggle, witnessing history unfold firsthand. It broadened his perspective, instilling in him a deep and abiding patriotism that would become a cornerstone of his identity, even when he lived thousands of miles away on foreign soil. He was no longer just a shopkeeper's apprentice. He was a soldier in defense of his country. With the war disrupting trade along the New England coast, opportunity beckoned elsewhere. His uncle, John Peabody, had established a business in Georgetown, a district of Washington, D.C., and he invited his ambitious young nephew to join him. It was here, in the orbit of the nation's capital, that George's trajectory would change forever. It was also here that he met the man who would become his first great partner, Elisha Riggs. Riggs was an older, established merchant. He saw in the young, intense, and meticulously organized George Peabody a rare spark. He recognized the boy's fierce ambition, his uncanny grasp of numbers, and his unwavering integrity. In 1814, Riggs brought Peabody into his business. Within a few years, Peabody rose to become a partner. The firm of Riggs and Peabody was born. Soon after, they made the pivotal decision to relocate their headquarters to what was then America's third largest and most dynamic city, Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore was a city on the rise, a bustling port with deep connections to both the agricultural South and the industrializing North. Its harbor was a gateway to the Caribbean, and more importantly, to the markets of Europe. For a business engaged in international trade, it was the perfect launch pad. The partnership was a perfect synergy of talents. Riggs provided the capital and the established network. Peabody provided the relentless, inexhaustible energy. He became the firm's traveling salesman, its engine of growth. In an age before railways, this was an arduous and often perilous undertaking. He journeyed on horseback and by stagecoach, through muddy roads and primitive trails, venturing into the small towns and frontier settlements of Maryland, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. He wasn't just selling goods, he was building a network of trust. Merchants in these remote areas came to rely on George Peabody. They knew his goods were of the quality he promised, and his prices were fair. More importantly, they knew he was a man of his word. He developed an almost supernatural ability to judge character, to know who was a good credit risk and who was not. This skill, honed in the dusty back rooms of frontier general stores, would be the bedrock of his future banking empire. He wasn't just trading in cloth and hardware. He was trading in the most valuable commodity of all, trust. The business flourished. Riggs and Peabody became one of the largest mercantile houses in the United States, importing finished goods from Britain and exporting American raw materials, primarily cotton. George was the driving force, working with a single-minded intensity that left little room for anything else. He had no time for leisure, no interest in social frivolities. His life was the business. Every waking hour was dedicated to its growth, to the meticulous accumulation of capital. By 1829, Elisha Riggs, content with the fortune they had amassed, decided to retire. The firm was reorganized as Peabody, Riggs and Company, with George now the senior partner. He was 34 years old. The boy who had left school at 11, who had lost everything in a fire, was now the head of a major international trading house. It was a remarkable achievement, a testament to his sheer force of will. But for George Peabody, it was only the beginning. He had mastered the American side of the transatlantic trade. He understood the supply chains, the markets, the credit systems, but he recognized a fundamental truth about the flow of global capital. The goods and the raw materials might move back and forth across the Atlantic, but the real power, the money itself, resided in one place, the city of London, the undisputed financial center of the world. He had built a powerful engine of commerce in Baltimore, but he knew that to reach the next level, to become a true master of finance, he had to go to the source. A plan began to form in his mind, a plan so audacious that few American merchants of his day would have even dared to conceive it. He would not just trade with London. He would move there. He would beat the British at their own game, in their own backyard. The stage was set for the next and most dramatic chapter of his life. The American merchant was about to become a London banker. The boy from Danvers had conquered Baltimore. Now he set his sights on the heart of the British Empire, a city of unimaginable wealth, power, and deeply entrenched traditions. It was a gamble of epic proportions, a leap into the unknown that would either secure his place in the annals of financial history or see him broken by the most sophisticated and ruthless market on earth, London. In the 1830s, it was more than just a city. It was the center of the known universe, the political heart of a globe-spanning empire, the crucible of the Industrial Revolution, and, above all, the undisputed king of global finance. Its banks, trading houses, and stock exchange were the nexus through which the world's wealth flowed. The pound sterling was the planet's reserve currency, and the word of a London banker could make or break nations. It was a world of immense power, governed by arcane traditions, exclusive social circles, and a deep-seated suspicion of outsiders, especially of brash, upstart Americans. Into this formidable fortress of finance in 1837 walked George Peabody. He was 42 years old, a wealthy and respected merchant in his own country, but in London he was a nobody. He arrived not as a tourist, but as an invader, albeit a quiet and meticulously polite one. he established a small office and counting house at number 31 Moorgate, christening it simply George Peabody and Company. His initial business was much the same as it had been in Baltimore, facilitating trade, acting as a purchasing agent for American importers. But his true ambition lay in a far more sophisticated and lucrative game, finance, specifically the trade in securities. America in the 1830s was a land of explosive growth and insatiable ambition. It was building canals, laying the first miles of railroad tracks, and expanding westward. These monumental projects required staggering amounts of capital, far more than the young nation's own financial system could provide. The money, the serious investment capital, was here in London. The challenge was connecting the two. British investors were intrigued by the high returns offered by American ventures, but they were also deeply wary. America was seen as a wild, unruly, and financially undisciplined place. Its currency was unstable, its states were known to be unreliable debtors, and its business culture seemed reckless. George Peabody saw his opportunity in this gap between American need and British skepticism. He would be the bridge. He understood both worlds. He knew the American landscape, the specific projects, and the people behind them. He could separate the sound investments from the speculative gambles. And having spent years building his own reputation for unimpeachable integrity, he could offer British investors something they desperately needed: a trusted intermediary. He could vouch for these American securities, putting his own name and fortune on the line. As if on cue, just as Peabody was setting up his London operation, disaster struck. The panic of 1837 swept across the United States, a devastating financial crisis that triggered a deep and prolonged depression. Banks failed by the hundreds, businesses collapsed, unemployment soared. The crisis was fueled by rampant land speculation, unsound lending practices, and a sudden contraction of credit from British lenders who had grown nervous about their American exposure. The fallout was catastrophic, not just for the American economy, but for its reputation abroad. Several American states, their revenues decimated by the Depression, defaulted on the bonds they had sold to European investors. The state of Maryland was one of them. For British financiers, this was the ultimate sin. Their worst fears about American unreliability had been confirmed. The flow of capital across the Atlantic dried up to a trickle. American credit was in tatters, and any American in London seeking to do business was met with cold hostility. For any other aspiring banker, this would have been the end. For George Peabody, it was the opportunity of a lifetime. While others saw ruin, he saw a chance to prove his worth. His own firm, thanks to his cautious and prudent management, weathered the storm. But his defining moment came in his defense of his home state, Maryland. The state of Maryland needed to pay the interest on its bonds to its European creditors, or face permanent financial disgrace. But its treasury was empty. State officials sent an agent to London to try and negotiate a new loan, a seemingly impossible task. No one would touch American debt. The agent, desperate, turned to the one man who might be able to help: George Peabody. Peabody knew that the future of American finance in Europe hinged on this moment. He embarked on a one-man crusade to save Maryland's honor. He spent a staggering £10,000 of his own money, a colossal sum at the time, on a public relations campaign. He wrote articles, lobbied influential bankers and politicians, and used his every connection to argue that Maryland was a fundamentally sound debtor that had simply fallen on hard times. But words were not enough. To finally secure the loan, he put his entire business and personal fortune on the line, acting as the guarantor. It was an act of breathtaking financial courage. If Maryland defaulted again, he would be personally ruined. But his gamble was based on a deep faith in his country and a calculated understanding of the situation. He succeeded. The loan was secured, Maryland resumed its interest payments, and its credit was restored. This single act transformed George Peabody's standing in London. He was no longer just another foreign merchant. He had become the unofficial financial ambassador of the United States. He had proven, through his own wallet, that he was a man of integrity who stood by his commitments. He had demonstrated that he believed in America's long-term promise, even in its darkest hour. Trust, the currency he had so carefully accumulated over decades, began to pay dividends. Investors who had been burned by state defaults now saw a safe path back into the lucrative American market. They would go through Peabody. He became the gatekeeper, the trusted validator of American securities. His endorsement on a bond was as good as gold. George Peabody and Company was no longer just a trading house. It was a bona fide merchant bank, and its founder was on his way to becoming one of the most powerful financiers in the world. As his wealth and influence grew, Peabody cultivated a unique social position. He was a staunchly patriotic American living in the heart of London, a city that often held a condescending view of his home country. He decided to use his growing fortune to bridge this cultural divide. He began hosting lavish 4th of Independence Day dinners, grand affairs that became a highlight of the London social season. These were not just parties, they were masterful acts of public diplomacy. He would invite the cream of British society, dukes, earls, cabinet ministers, and powerful editors, and seat them alongside visiting American senators, writers, and businessmen. In an era of often fraught Anglo-American relations, Peabody's dining room became a neutral ground, a place for dialogue and mutual understanding. He famously refused to allow the customary toast to the Queen until after a toast to the President of the United States had been offered, a small but firm assertion of his national pride. He was a cultural ambassador as much as a financial one, spending a fortune to present America in the best possible light. Yet behind the facade of the powerful banker and gracious host, a deep and profound loneliness was taking root. London, for all the success it brought him, was a foreign city. He was an outsider, a permanent bachelor who had sacrificed personal relationships for professional ambition. His life revolved around the cold, hard calculus of finance. He worked relentlessly, often to the detriment of his health, suffering from severe gout and other ailments. His frugality, once a virtue born of necessity, now became a strange eccentricity. He lived in rented rooms, not a grand mansion, and famously complained about the cost of his own lavish dinners. There was a disconnect between the immense wealth he controlled and the Spartan life he led. It was as if the boy from Danvers, terrified of poverty, still resided within the millionaire banker, unable to truly enjoy the fruits of his labor. He never married. There were whispers of a youthful romance back in America, a love lost, but the details are shrouded in the mists of time. In London, he remained resolutely single. Perhaps he felt he had no time for a family, or perhaps the emotional vulnerability required for marriage was something he could no longer access. His business was his wife, his ledger books were his children. This profound personal choice, this absence of a direct family, would have consequences he could not yet fully appreciate. It was the single critical factor that would ultimately lead to the disappearance of his name. As the years wore on, the demands of the business became too much for one man. In 1854, Peabody sought a partner to help manage his flourishing empire. He found him in Junius Spencer Morgan, a successful American merchant from Hartford, Connecticut. Morgan was everything Peabody needed: experienced, ambitious, and possessing a keen financial mind. He made Morgan a partner, and the firm entered a new, even more prosperous phase. This partnership would prove to be one of the most consequential in financial history. Peabody, the aging pioneer, had found his successor, and in Junius Morgan, he had unwittingly laid the foundation for an even greater dynasty. For Junius's son, a young man named John Pierpont Morgan, was already watching from the wings, learning from the two masters. The stage was being set for the rise of the House of Morgan, but it would be built upon the foundations laid stone by painstaking stone by the boy from Danvers. George Peabody had conquered London and amassed a fortune beyond his wildest dreams. But a new nagging question began to occupy his mind. What was it all for? What would be the ultimate purpose of this mountain of gold? The accumulation of wealth, once the sole focus of his life, was beginning to feel hollow. He had reached the pinnacle of financial success, but he remained a man alone. As he entered the twilight of his career, he began to contemplate his legacy, a legacy not of blood, for he would have no children, but of purpose. This shift in focus would lead to his greatest and most enduring achievement, an act of generosity so vast and so visionary it would forever change the meaning of giving back. By the mid-19th century, George Peabody was no longer just a banker. He was a transatlantic force of nature. His firm, now bolstered by the formidable energy of Junius Morgan, stood at the apex of international finance. He was a true titan of two worlds, with one foot planted firmly in the sophisticated capital markets of London and the other in the explosive raw potential of the United States. His wealth was no longer counted in the thousands, but in the millions. $16 million at the time of his death, a sum so vast it is difficult to comprehend. In today's terms, adjusting for the share of the economy, it would be equivalent to many billions, placing him in the same rarefied air as the great industrial tycoons who would follow. His fortune was built on financing the very sinews of American expansion. The 1850s were the age of the railroad, the iron horse that was stitching together a continent. Laying thousands of miles of track across prairies, rivers, and mountains required capital on an unprecedented scale. George Peabody and Company became one of the primary conduits for that capital, channeling British investment into American railroad bonds. He wasn't just betting on companies. He was betting on the future of America itself, on the doctrine of manifest destiny, and his bets paid off spectacularly. But his vision went beyond railroads. He was an early and enthusiastic backer of one of the most audacious technological ventures of the 19th century, the transatlantic telegraph cable. The idea of sending messages almost instantaneously across the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean seemed like science fiction, a fool's dream. The challenges were immense: engineering, logistical, and financial. The first attempts failed dramatically, the fragile cables snapping and being lost to the crushing depths. Many financiers dismissed the project as a catastrophic waste of money, but Peabody, along with a few other visionaries, understood its revolutionary potential. He saw a future where information could travel at the speed of light, shrinking the globe and transforming international commerce forever. He invested heavily, providing the crucial financial backing that kept the project alive through its numerous, heartbreaking setbacks. When the cable was finally completed successfully in 1866, it was a world-changing moment, the birth of our modern, interconnected age. And behind the scenes, providing the quiet, essential support, was the banker from Danvers. He was investing not just in assets, but in the future itself. This period of immense success was, however, set against the backdrop of his home country's greatest crisis. In 1861, the American Civil War erupted. The conflict between the Union and the Confederacy sent shockwaves across the Atlantic, particularly to London. The British financial establishment was deeply divided. Many in the ruling class, whose textile mills depended on Southern cotton, were sympathetic to the Confederacy. They saw the Union as a risky bet and believed the country would inevitably fracture. This created an incredibly perilous situation for the U.S. government, which desperately needed to sell bonds in Europe to finance its war effort. Once again, American credit hung in the balance. And once again, George Peabody stepped into the breach. He threw the full weight of his firm and his personal reputation behind the Union cause. In a market deeply skeptical of Union victory, E supported Union credit in London and helped maintain American financial standing, though key bond sales were later dominated by J. Cook and other agents. Government bonds in London. This bold and deeply patriotic act provided a critical financial lifeline to the Lincoln administration and cemented his status as a transatlantic titan. He had helped save his nation from afar, proving his influence could shape the destiny of countries. Yet this very zenith of public achievement cast a long shadow over his private life. As the cheers for the Union victory echoed across the ocean, they seemed to fall upon deaf ears in his own quiet, furnished rooms. The man who could move markets and fund nations found himself ever more solitary. He never owned a home in London, preferring this life of almost monastic simplicity, a life where his personal expenses were so famously trivial that he would meticulously pick up a dropped, half-smoked cigar from a park path, remarking that it was a perfectly good smoke going to waste. While other magnates built palaces, he saved cigar butts, a billionaire haunted not by the fear of future poverty, but by a profound and unshakable loneliness. This extreme frugality was a source of both amusement and bewilderment to his contemporaries. But it was not about greed. It was a reflection of a man who never felt entitled to his wealth, who saw it not as a personal possession to be squandered, but as a great trust, a tool to be wielded for a higher purpose. He was a custodian of capital, not a consumer of it. This detachment from material pleasure reflected a deeper emotional cost. He remained a man surrounded by crowds, yet profoundly alone. He was surrounded by people who wanted his money, his influence, his endorsement. He hosted grand dinners and was a celebrated public figure. Yet he seems to have had very few, if any, truly intimate friends. His correspondence reveals a man preoccupied with business and health, with little mention of personal joy or companionship. There was one notable exception, a hint of what might have been. In his younger days, during his visits back to America, he became deeply infatuated with a beautiful and accomplished young woman from a prominent Rhode Island family, Esther Elizabeth Hoppin, known as Lise. He was clearly smitten, and for a time it seemed a match might be possible. But Peabody was already a man driven by a singular ambition. He was about to make his permanent move to London, to embark on the great gamble of his life. Lise, for her part, ended up marrying another man. The romance, if it can be called that, flickered and died. He would remain in contact with her family for years, a lingering connection to a different path, a life of domesticity he chose not to pursue. We can never know for certain why he never married. Perhaps it was the memory of this lost love. Perhaps his relentless focus on business left no room for a wife and family. Or perhaps he feared that any potential suitor would be more interested in his fortune than in him. Whatever the reason, the decision to remain a bachelor was the single most important factor in the ultimate fate of the Peabody name. A Rockefeller or a Morgan could build a business and a family to carry it on. Peabody was building an empire for a kingdom with no prince. By the 1860s, Peabody had achieved something no American before him ever had. He was not just respected in Britain, he was revered. He had become a figure of immense public affection and admiration, a symbol of Anglo-American friendship, and a model of integrity. Queen Victoria honored him for his philanthropy, commissioning a personal letter and a miniature portrait, unprecedented gestures for a private American citizen. It was an unprecedented honor for an American citizen. But Peabody, in a move that spoke volumes about his character, politely declined. He explained that his loyalty was to his own country, and such a title would be inconsistent with his Republican principles. He did, however, suggest that a letter from the Queen, acknowledging his efforts to foster goodwill between the two nations, would be a treasure he would value above all else. The Queen obliged, writing a heartfelt personal letter of thanks and commissioning a magnificent miniature portrait of herself to be given to him. These were honors no title could match, a personal acknowledgement from the most powerful woman in the world. He had reached the summit. He possessed wealth, fame, and the respect of 2 continents. And yet the central question of his life remained unanswered. What was the point? He was growing older. His health was failing. He had no children to inherit his fortune, no dynasty to perpetuate his name. He could simply allow his millions to be divided among distant relatives, to be diluted and eventually disappear, or he could do something else, something radical, something that had never been done before on such a scale. He began to see his vast fortune not as a monument to his own success, but as a solution to the world's suffering. The poverty he had escaped in his youth still haunted him. The ignorance he had overcome through sheer will still plagued millions. He looked at the squalid, teeming slums of London, the city that had made him rich, and he saw the desperate faces of the poor. He looked across the ocean to his own country, ravaged by war and divided by bitterness, and he saw a generation of children, particularly in the defeated South, with no schools to attend and no hope for the future. It was in these 2 great crises, the poverty of London and the ignorance of the American South, that George Peabody would find his ultimate purpose. The titan of finance was about to transform himself into the father of modern philanthropy. He had spent a lifetime accumulating. Now, he would spend his final years giving it all away. It was a decision that would not only cement his legacy, but would create a new model for how the world's wealthy could use their fortunes for the public good, a model that continues to influence and inspire to this day. To understand the sheer, world-altering impact of George Peabody's next act, you must first understand the London he saw every day. Beyond the grand facades of the banks and the manicured parks of the aristocracy lay another city, a city of shadows, of crushing poverty, of human misery on an industrial scale. This was the London of Charles Dickens, a sprawling metropolis where hundreds of thousands were packed into squalid, disease-ridden slums. Families of 8, 9, or 10 people lived in a single unventilated room with no running water and no sanitation. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis were rampant. For the deserving poor, the honest, hard-working laborers and their families who were simply unable to earn a living wage, there was no safety net, and housing was their single greatest and most desperate need. Private landlords, operating with no regulation, charged exorbitant rents for squalid, dangerous properties. The alternative was the dreaded workhouse, a place of last resort that was little more than a prison, designed to be so miserable that it would deter anyone from seeking public aid. This was the brutal reality of life for a huge portion of the population in the wealthiest city on earth. Politicians and social reformers debated the problem endlessly, but no one had a practical, large-scale solution. George Peabody, the man who had spent his life in the clean, orderly world of finance, was deeply moved and horrified by what he saw. He had clawed his way out of poverty, and he had never forgotten its sting. He believed that a decent home was not a luxury, but a fundamental prerequisite for a decent life. How could a child study, or a father maintain his dignity, or a mother keep her family healthy, without a clean, safe place to live? He conceived of an idea that was, at the time, completely revolutionary. He would use his private fortune to tackle this public crisis head-on. He consulted with his closest confidants, men like the Earl of Shaftesbury, a leading British social reformer, and Sir Curtis Lampson, a fellow American expatriate. He wasn't interested in simple charity, in giving handouts that would provide only temporary relief. He wanted to create a sustainable, permanent solution. His plan was to build and manage large housing estates specifically for the working poor of London. The rent would be set at a level they could genuinely afford, covering only the cost of maintenance and a very small return to allow the fund to grow, but not to generate profit. The focus would be on providing families with clean, spacious, and healthy homes. It was a radical fusion of business principles with philanthropic intent. On March 12, 1862, he made his move. He wrote a letter to the trustees he had selected, formally donating the immense sum of £150,000 to establish the Peabody Donation Fund, later known as the Peabody Trust. The gift caused a sensation. It was at the time the largest single philanthropic donation in British history. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic hailed it as an act of princely generosity. But Peabody was just getting started. He would later add another £350,000 to the fund, bringing his total contribution to £500,000, an astronomical figure, equivalent to well over £100 million today. The trust began its work immediately, purchasing land in rundown areas like Spitalfields and Islington. The buildings they erected were revolutionary. They were solid 5-story blocks of flats, built with light and air in mind. Each flat had multiple rooms, its own scullery with running water, and access to shared laundry facilities and bathrooms. Unheard of luxuries for the urban poor. There were even playgrounds for the children. This wasn't just housing. It was a blueprint for a new, more humane way of urban living. For the families who moved in, it was like stepping into a different world, a world of safety, cleanliness, and dignity. Even as his great project in London was taking shape, Peabody's heart turned to his homeland. The American Civil War had ended in 1865, leaving behind a nation scarred and a South in ruins. The economic and social devastation was almost total. But Peabody, with the insight of a man who had been denied an education, knew that the deepest wounds were not to the infrastructure, but to the minds of a generation. The public school system across the South had been obliterated. For millions of children, both black and white, the future looked bleak. A cycle of poverty and ignorance seemed all but inevitable. He saw that political reconstruction would fail without educational reconstruction. In 1867, during a visit to America, he made his second monumental gift to humanity. He established the Peabody Education Fund, endowing it with the then unthinkable sum of $2 million. Its mission was breathtaking in its scope: to encourage the intellectual, moral, and industrial education of the destitute children of the southern states. What made the fund so revolutionary was its approach. In a time of intense political and racial bitterness, Peabody insisted that the fund be strictly nonpartisan and nonsectarian. It was to help all children in need, regardless of their race. This was an incredibly progressive and controversial stance. The fund worked not by building its own schools, but by providing matching funds to communities that were willing to establish and support their own free public schools. It was a brilliant strategy, fostering local buy-in and creating a sustainable system from the ground up. The Peabody Education Fund became a pivotal force in rebuilding the South, laying the groundwork for public education across the region for generations to come. George Peabody had given away the majority of his vast fortune, over $9 million in total. He had created institutions that would outlive him by centuries, transforming the lives of countless thousands. But the man himself was fading. His health, always fragile, began to decline rapidly. In the autumn of 1869, he fell gravely ill. He died on November 4th in London, the city he had conquered. The news of his death was met with an unprecedented outpouring of grief on both sides of the Atlantic. He was a private American citizen, yet he was mourned like royalty. His initial funeral was held in Westminster Abbey, an honor reserved for Britain's greatest heroes. The Queen herself wished for him to be buried there, but Peabody's will was clear. He wished to be laid to rest in his hometown of Danvers, Massachusetts. What happened next was one of the most remarkable gestures in the history of international diplomacy. To transport his body home, Queen Victoria ordered that the newest and most powerful ship in the Royal Navy, the ironclad warship HMS Monarch, be commissioned for the task. It was an honor of unimaginable proportions. The British Empire sent its greatest warship on a mission of peace to carry the body of a beloved American philanthropist across the ocean. The journey of the Monarch, accompanied by an American naval escort, captured the world's imagination, a silent, solemn testament to the love and respect one man had earned from two nations. His final funeral in America was a national event, a moment of solemn reflection on a life of incredible achievement and unparalleled generosity. George Peabody was laid to rest, his life's work complete. But now, the final crucial question of his legacy had to be answered. What would become of the financial empire he had built, and what of the Peabody name? The answer lay in the partnership he had forged years earlier. Upon his retirement, control of George Peabody and Company had passed to his partner, Junius Spencer Morgan. The firm was renamed J.S. Morgan and Company, and under the shrewd leadership of Junius and his even more brilliant son, J.P. Morgan, it would grow into the most powerful investment bank in the world, the mighty House of Morgan. The business Peabody had created lived on and thrived, but his name was erased from the letterhead. And so we arrive at the final poignant irony of this incredible story. George Peabody's legacy is everywhere, yet his family is nowhere. The Peabody Trust continues to be one of London's largest and most important providers of social housing. The seeds planted by the Peabody Education Fund grew into universities and public school systems. Museums, libraries, and concert halls still bear his name. His impact on the world is tangible, powerful, and enduring. But the Peabody family as a financial or social dynasty vanished because he had no children and because he chose to channel his fortune into philanthropy rather than inheritance. There was no one to carry the name forward in the world of power and wealth. Unlike the Rockefellers, who built a dynasty on oil and philanthropy, or the Morgans, who built a dynasty on the very bank Peabody founded, the Peabody line ended. He represents one of the first and greatest of the American self-made millionaires, a man who wrote the rules for international finance. But his story is a profound lesson in the fragility of a family legacy. Without a plan for succession, without heirs to carry the torch, even the greatest of names can fade into the quiet pages of history. In the end, George Peabody made a choice. He chose humanity over heredity. He chose to build institutions rather than a dynasty. He gave his money to the poor, the uneducated, the public good. He became the father to thousands of families. He housed and millions of children he educated, but he had no children of his own. His name may have disappeared from the ranks of America's elite, but his work is woven into the very fabric of our society. And perhaps that is the greatest and most enduring legacy of all.